where we left off last time was on the difficulty, how all the Buddhas in the 10 directions praised Shakyamuni Buddha for having accomplished a extremely difficult task. And that actually several tasks. One is being mindfulness of Amitabha can lead to enlightenment. That is one extremely difficult task. And the second one was on how to achieve ultimate enlightenment in the world of five stabilities. And so let's, and then where we left up last time was we started to talk about the four types of Buddha mindfulness. We talked about mindfulness based on realizing the truth. Before we get to, and then that taught, there are two kinds of truth: emptiness of self and emptiness of Dharma. But before we get to emptiness of Dhamma, let's discuss the humanly difficult task that the Shakyamuni Buddha achieved and how rare it is to have the Buddha appear in our world. We often see in the Mahayana sutras that there are numerous, incalculable number of Buddhas, as many as the sands in the Ganges River, and that that Buddhas appear everywhere throughout the universe. So even though we see that often in the Mahayana Sutra, but in reality, it is extremely rare for a Buddha to appear in our world, especially from the human point of view. So rare that not every kappa, which is eon, is so fortunate to have the appearance of the Buddha. During the period during the eons where there are no Buddha, this is called Sunna kappas, or empty eons. And the kappas that are so fortunate to have the Buddhas, they are of different types. There are essentially 5 kinds of eons. One is that there's a Sarakappa where there's only one Buddha appearing in that kappa, that period of time. Or keep kappa, like keep jie. One kappa is an eon where there's only one Buddha appearing. And then there's another type where manda, where there are 2 Buddhas appearing, or 3 Buddhas appearing, or even 4 Buddhas appearing, and then lastly, no fewer than 5 Buddhas, and that's called a greatly auspicious eon. Some texts even say that in the greatly auspicious eons, in this eon, which is our eon right now, that there will be 1,000 Buddhas appearing during this period. So that it is greatly auspicious. Jixiang, auspicious. Which is the Hinayana, the Nanchuan, right? The Namjun. In the Pali text, they reference only 27 previous Buddhas before Shakyamuni Buddha and Maitreya Buddha. So a total of 29 Buddhas. Which this is vastly different from the Mahayana text where it says numerous Buddhas in the past, the present, and the future. In the Theravadan tradition, even with the period that between one Buddha and the next varies from one Mahakappa to a Sankhya of Mahakappa. So it can vary in terms of periods. There's an empty eons, which is very wide in terms of time, that there could be no Buddhas appearing. So this unthinkably remote period is very long. And for example, during the period that Shakyamuni Buddha became a Buddha, from the time that Shakyamuni Buddha was still an ascetic practicing to get to enlightenment, to the time that he became known as Shakyamuni Buddha in the present eon, is an unthinkable duration of time. And after Dipankara, there was no Buddha appearing in the world at all, in our world systems. So you can see that we are so lucky to have, at least we are far, the Buddha had appeared and left the world, and we didn't have a chance to see him, to learn from him, but at least we still are learning his Dharma, even though we have separated from Shakyamuni Buddha about 2,500 years, but in terms of eon, that is still a very short period of time, so we are still very lucky. So how long is a kappa? Một kiếp, how long is a kappa? In the sutras, the Buddha says, long indeed is the eon. It's very long. And the disciple asked the Buddha for an illustration. He says that if you were to take a mountain, like a very big mountain in the size of 4 leagues in length, in width, and in height. So 1 league is about 3.5 miles. So that's about 12 miles. So you take a square of 12 by 12 by 12, that's 1,728 cubic mile. Now we look at this temple city, it's about 4 square miles. And 4 square miles, but you make it into a cube. So this mountain, this block of rock that big, is about 27 times the size of Temple City. So imagine that once every 100 years, you come by and you swipe gently. You just swipe gently with a piece of cloth or a feather every 100 years until that the big block of rock disappears. It is still a shorter duration than 1 kappa. So we can see that 1 kappa is extremely long period of time. So this kappa, when the Buddha says 1 kappa, it is not by any process of mathematical computation, but it's more of spiritual imagination. We can only use poetry. We can only use myths, if you will, to illustrate of this unthinkable unthinkable period of time. Another example that the Buddha gave in the sutras to explain what kappa means is that it's a cycle of 1 world period. And it's not just our world, but the entire world system. And that period is divided, 1 kappa is divided into 4 periods. The eons of evolution and the continuance, and then the eons of evolutions and the continuance of it. In other words, is 行住坏空, 探逐坏空. So during that 4 periods, that's what makes up a kappa. So the cycle of forming, sustaining, decaying, and complete destruction, going through that cycle will complete 1 kappa. So the kappa is a period that elapses between the complete destructions and the complete renovations of 1 world system. The Pali text proceed to classify this even further, is that each Asankhya kappa, Asanjijie, Atanki kip, is divided into 20 Antara kappas, which is the middle kappa. And that is a period where the age of man increases from 10 years of age to a very long period. It says here 1 followed by 140 zeros. So a very long period of age that the person lifespan goes from 10 years to a very long time and then back to 10 years again, decaying. So that increase in lifespan from 10 years and then decrease back to 10 years. So that's one, this is 1 Sankhya kappa. So we can see that this period is a very long time, and for a Buddha to appear, it is indeed a very rare event. But the Buddha came to this world to and attained enlightenment not within one lifetime, but over many, many lifetimes. And that is because of his karma, of his practice. So in other words, he was slowly gathering weight from continuous past deeds, just like the snowflakes, very tiny, very small, but over time it could form a lot of snow on the ground. And so similarly, the Buddha gained his spiritual momentum to a point where it was able to get him to enlightenment. So attaining of enlightenment by getting rid of desire, anger, and ignorance. It was a cumulative effort and aspirations of countless lives dedicated to the attainment of one supreme objective, which is enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. So if we want to become a Buddha, it's not just a 1 or 2 days practice, but it's a lifetime, it's a commitment of a lifetime. So for us to be serious about going to the Western Pure Land, it can't be just a thought, but it has to be a lifetime commitment, right? In order to gain enough momentum. So going to the Western Pure Land is an easier task compared to the Buddha, who has spent millions and millions of lives in the past to have this cumulative effect and generate enough spiritual momentum. So he essentially was the inheritor of the results of actions performed during an incalculably long series of lives in the past. So when the Buddha came to this world and attained enlightenment, it was a mystic marriage of the human and divine, the individual and the universe, terrestrials and cosmic. It was a magical event that came together that we are now able to learn about it. So the Buddhas are born not for themselves alone, but for the sake of all sentient beings, out of compassion for the world and the welfare, profit, and happiness of gods and men. So they are world teachers, right? Teachers of God and man. And this teaching has to be discovered afresh by each of the Buddhas. So even though there's a lineage of Buddhas, but sometimes this teaching is lost and it has to be rediscovered. So when we vow to become Buddhas, we are essentially willing to take on a huge responsibility because we are asking for infinite merits and wisdom. So when we go to Sukhavati in the Western Pure Land, it is not just to escape suffering for our own little self, but we should remind ourselves that we are taking on a huge responsibility in wanting to become Buddhas. So therefore, we shouldn't mind the little hardships that we encounter along the way. So those little hardships are nothing. All right, so we should not mind and we should not give up along the way. So as time progresses and as human beings become more and more degenerate, the Dhamma disappears from the hearts and minds of men. That's why it has to be rediscovered because it gets lost, and human beings completely have forgotten about it. The disappearance of the Dhamma means that nirvana is rendered impossible of access. Emancipations, 解脱, 解脱, right? Emancipations from the rounds of birth of the 生死轮回, the cycle of life and death becomes a dream. So escaping from that cycle of life and death is a dream. So in a way, even though we say we're in the ending period, for some in the ending period of the Dhamma, in some way, the Dhamma has already disappeared for many Buddhists. right? Aspiration for enlightenment has been replaced by praying and begging for material comforts and protection from the Buddha. And they no longer believe that it is possible for them to attain Buddhahood. And some even are not even aware of that possibility. They go to the temple, but they have no idea that they can be Buddhas. They pray into a statue, but they don't know themselves that they have this Buddha seed in them. So to them, the Dhamma has been forgotten. So unfortunately, some don't even realize that Shakyamuni Buddha was a real and historical figure. Some thought that the Buddha was just a mysterious figure that people should worship. And to them, who have forgotten about the sutras, the Dhamma, the sutras are what they pray to and not for applying in their daily lives. Right? They pray to the sutras, but they don't apply the sutras. They don't think that the sutras have anything to do with their lives. So in that sense, the Dhamma is rendered a disappearance from the world. So it cannot be argued that there are other ways to enlightenment. The Dhamma is the way to enlightenment. And this is not a dogmatic prejudice in favor of the teachings, but this is the universal law, the conditions. We have to provide the proper condition in order to get to enlightenment. And the Dhamma opens to us the conditions to attain enlightenment. The disappearance of the Dhamma means essentially the disappearance of the principal knowledge of the means to enlightenment, to liberation. The outside the Dhamma, it is impossible to achieve liberation. So by the disappearance of the Dhamma, it is not just the passing away of this or that religion, but a total eclipse of that knowledge of the means to emancipation, to liberation. And this period of darkness, the path to nirvana is completely forgotten. And it may be forgotten for hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. So that's why the importance of the auspicious arrival of the Buddha, how he was able to rediscover the way, reproclaim the way, was a very fortunate event for us, because we still have this, the benefit of it. Just like the sun shining during the day, although we miss seeing the sun, but we can still feel the heat from the sun. So we are reaping the heat of the sun, but if eventually that heat will disappear, and it disappears not because the sun has gone away, but it disappears because people don't, the heat is no longer there. And the Dhamma disappears because people start to see a big difference, a big gap between themselves and the Dharma. They don't see that the Dharma has anything to do with their lives. The Buddha's greatness consists not only the fact that he attained nirvana for himself, but that he discovered this path and allowed millions and millions of sentient beings to achieve the same result. And he did this to get to this point. He did this at the cost of his life, right? Then even 10,000, he did this at the cost of his life so that other sentient beings could ascend with ease. They could achieve liberation with ease. So the Buddha voluntarily sacrificed his life so that others could achieve liberation. We are very fortunate that we don't have to risk our lives or our limbs to study the Buddha. When we study the Buddha, when we come to the class, there is no fear of being arrested or of being killed. So we are very fortunate. But the Buddha, in the past, in one scripture, he said that when he was practicing seeking the truth, that he was willing to sacrifice his life to hear one verse of the truth. In fact, to hear half of the truth, the verse, that he was willing to sacrifice his life. So we honor the masters or the Buddha not as an arhat, alahan, but as a Buddha, having qualified himself for the superhumanly difficult task by practicing the 10 perfections, 波罗蜜, for an incalculable number of lives. Without a teacher and without guide, he was able to break through obstacles, and that blocked the path to nirvana and opened the path to all sentient beings. So the appearance of a Buddha is extremely rare. And what Shakyamuni Buddha accomplished was an extraordinary, special, very difficult task. So that should help us to appreciate what the Buddha has achieved, and that's why all the Buddhas in the 10 directions praise Shakyamuni Buddha. Okay. All right, now let's go to the next step, which is the emptiness of Dhamma. Dhamma, this word is full of meanings. There are many interpretations of what Dhamma is. Dhamma means phenomena, not the teachings, but everything. Dhamma, in this case, with a lower D, means everything, whereas Dhamma, with the upper D, means the teaching, the truth, the principle, what the Buddha taught. So this Dhamma is called all phenomena, all everything, Fa, right? Some schools believe they have different interpretations. One interpretation is that all dhammas conditionally exist. They are insubstantial, meaning they have no self. And this helps to avoid self-view. But there were other schools, especially the Xiaoceng, especially the Hinayana. There were other schools that believe in the existence of Dhamma nature. They truly believe that there is something that truly exists and permanent. This is what they call emptiness of the self, but existence of the Dhamma. So to them, there is no self, but there is something that makes up that self. That is truly existing. And this is what's called Savastivara, 说一切有不, right? This is a very interesting school because they, for a long period of time, they had such a great influence on Buddhism. And this is a little bit technical, but I think it's important to understand a little bit about them because it helps us to appreciate where we have come from. And this helps us to build a foundation for our thesis thesis to come. So I think it's important to understand this a little bit, even though it's a little bit technical, but if you can bear with me here. So about a century or more after the Buddha had entered nirvana, called parinirvana, there were tensions between monks. And there were a separation between schools, Mahasamjika and Stharavira. They had different ways of looking at the Dhamma, of practicing the Dhamma. And about a century that followed this Stharavira, it subdivided twice. One was it divided first. First, it came the Pudgalavadins. Pudgalavadins asserted that while there is no Atman, there is no self, but there exists a Pudgala. Pudgala is the person, a being, which is neither conditioned Dhamma nor unconditioned Dhamma, 有为法 and 违法. So to them, that it's in between. You cannot say it's conditioned nor conditioned. Hữu vi pháp và vô vi pháp. You cannot. They say that you cannot say it's conditioned nor non-conditioned. So that was their thinking. They believe in the existence of the person, the being, as a real absolute fact. So permanent and unchanging. And then there came the Sarvastivadins. This is a very powerful school back then. They had such an influence scholastically on Buddhism. Sarvastivadins, they said that they believed in real existence of the ultimate elements of experience of Dhamma throughout the 3 periods of time: the past, the present, and the future. So Sarvastivadins argue that all Dhammas exist in the past, the present, and the future. And this is the Chinese translation is very exact. It says, in Chinese, 说一切有部. So they say they believe, they teach that everything exists. Thuyết nhất thiết hữu bộ. They believe everything exists. So the school that speaks of the existence of everything. So you can see there was a difference in the way that they view reality. So in this way, there were 4 independent monastic corporations. They had their own centers. They have their own ordination lineage. And they had their own orally transmitted versions of the Dharma. And they have their own rules, principles, tenets. They had their own distinctive tenets. And they had their own outward observance, how they dress, the precepts, essentially, the outer precepts. The Sarvastivadins were retrospectively designated as Hinayana, tiểu thừa, 小乘, Hinayana. Sarvastivadins was the most widespread and influential Hinayana school. So that's why we should learn a little bit about them to help us understand how it is compared to Mahayana and the difference. Because they had such a big influence, we want to understand why there was such a big influence that they had. They devoted their study, they devoted to the study and propagation of Abhidhamma. Abhidhamma means about Dhamma or higher Dhamma. Abhidhamma, so they interpret the Dhamma in the sense of a philosophically more exact exposition of the teaching. So they're saying their explanation is technically exactly as what the Buddha taught. The Abhidhamma is a very technical volume of work. It defines technical terms, arranges numerically classified documents in numerical order, give a systematic philosophical exposition of the teachings, and establishes a consistent method of spiritual practice. So it defines step by step exactly, very technical, of how one should study and practice the Dharma. What happened was, as a result, it interprets the Dharma in terms of strict pluralistic terms. There's a meaning that there is a Mahayana is 无二法, right? 不二法. There's no dualism, but the way they interpret Dharma, it leads to pluralistic realism. The most important Sarvastivadin work is called Establishment of Knowledge. And essentially, They're very technical. In other words, they're very technical. Now, compared to Mahayana, the philosophical writings of great Mahayana sages such as Nagarjuna, Longsu Pusa, Long Tao Bồ Tát, and Asanga, Wu Zuo Pusa, Bo Zhi Bồ Tát, these great sages, even their writings, although immensely authoritative, they were never collected into Pitaka. So they were never considered as sutras, right? The Nagarjuna, Lungsu Pusa, Long Tao Bồ Tát. Nagarjuna's work was great, highly revered, but it was never considered as sutras. But whereas Sarvastivadins, their work was considered to be very authoritative and to be exact of what the Buddha taught. So therefore, we can see that Sarvastivadin tradition had a tremendous position and influence in Buddhism. But we should not see it as a division in Buddhism. We should see that they're not rival systems of thought. Not to say that this one is true, that one is false, but expressions on the intellectual plane of successively more advanced degrees of spiritual insight. In other words, it's how they see things from their perspective. So then we should not see that they're rivals, but they just see things differently. Sarvastivada was geographically the most widespread and historically the most important among the early schools. And they continued to flourish in India. And they had powerful establishments not only in Central but in many parts of Southeast Asia. So you can see that we may not heard much about them, but they are a big influence. They were a big influence. Differing from the parent body, Sarvastivadins may be regarded not as an independent school, but rather as a more liberal and progressive wing of Theravada. So they're more progressive. But they did have influence in Mahayana. Mahayana did incorporate into their own doctrines some of their teachings, but the way they incorporate the Hinayana's teachings, Xiao Cheng, Diu Tu, the way that they incorporate the Hinayana's teaching was to make those teachings as relative truth, whereas Mahayana was absolute truth. For example, how Sarvastivadins different from Theravadins was that Theravadins, their highest level of achievement is that of an arhat, Alahan. So that is, to them, that's the highest achievement. But Sarvastivadins, that it was possible for their disciples to not only achieve arhatship, but also achieve the pratyeka, Pichifo, and some Buddhahood. So they are going beyond arhatship. And this doctrine too was incorporated by the Mahayanists. So they did have such influence on Mahayana's work as well, thinking. Mahayanists and Sarvastivadins were in irreconcilable oppositions, but there is one principle that they cannot reconcile. They cannot come to reconciliation, and that is that Sarvastivadins believe that everything exists. They believe that everything exists, and that they believe that the substance of the 75 Dharmas had a permanent existence throughout the 3 periods of time, right? The past, the present, and the future. So it was this that Mahayana came to repudiate. And that because Mahayana's, their teaching does not believe in the universal, their doctrine is of universal insubstantiality. right? 自性空, tánh không, tự tánh không. Okay. Sarvastivadins, they treated Dharmas as the building blocks of life, if you will, that being themselves ultimately real. Those Dharmas are real. Therefore, they developed this pluralistic metaphysical outlook of conditions and unconditioned, 有为法, 无为法, right? 有为法, 无为法. So they have that pluralistic realism. Whereas Mahayana, their protest against the taking of historically early doctrines in so literal a sense as to preclude the possibility of their functioning as the means to enlightenment. So Mahayana, so there's a development, a movement against this. So this what they think is erroneous thinking. They thought that it was erroneous thinking. For example, like the sentence, the monk goes for alms. The monk goes for alms. This is not true in the ultimate sense because the words monk and self do not refer to any correspondent realities because they don't exist according to Mahayana. But for Hayanists, the will, the axle, and linchpin are real, but the chariot isn't real, meaning that this whole thing is unreal, but then yet you have the will and the linchpin, the critical parts of this chariot are real. That's how they see it. Or for example, they say that this circle of fire is unreal, but the torch and the person who spins this torch are real. So that's how they see it. So they see that this is unreal, but the things that make up the unreal are real. Mahayana essentially says that ultimate dhammas are independent on causes and conditions. They are not real. They are not real, but unreal by nature. So in other words, their doctrines are inclusive of both the unreal nature of things by incorporating the relative truth and the absolute truth. So to them, to Mahayanas, yes, things exist, but they conditionally exist. We cannot ignore that they exist, but yet we cannot say that they don't exist because they conditionally exist, right? So to the Mahayana, they take the Buddha's teaching as the raft, like a raft to cross the river. So the Dhamma is only the means, not the means in itself. So what is the use then? If the Mahayana looks at it this way, then what is the use of this things that is unreal? Well, Mahayana answered this questions. Answer the question of what is the point, what is the use of retaining the doctrines, right? If the sutras are not real, why do we retain them? If the teaching is not real, it's just a raft, it's not the means in itself, then what's the point in preserving the Dhamma, the teaching? Well, Mahayanas, the answer is that Mahayanas retain them because only by means of conventional truth could the absolute truth be realized. So it's incorporating both the conventional truth and the absolute truth. It's called a true truth. All right, one is conventional and one is absolute. So one was the stepping stone to the other. So when we cross the other, when we have crossed to the other shore, over to the other shore, we no longer need a raft, right, to cross the river to the other shore. But we don't destroy it. We should not destroy it. Out of compassion that we should preserve the raft for others to use. So just because we have understood the Dhamma, we should not destroy the sutras. Out of compassion, that we should share the teachings, what we've learned, with others. So that's Mahayana's perspective is, yes, it is not real absolutely, but we should not destroy this raft, the sutras, because other people could use the sutras. It could be a benefits to them. The sutras could be a benefits to them. So in order to give a negative description, there must be, first of all, something to negate. This something here is the conventional truth. So only by means of the negation of these doctrines can the only possible definition of reality emerge. So even though we know that this world doesn't really exist, but this world does help us to get to enlightenment. In this way, Mahayanas were able to develop their own distinctive doctrines without repudiating those of the Hinayana. So this is why Mahayana can accept Hinayana, but Hinayana cannot accept Mahayana. Without understanding the Mahayana version of the true truth, full understanding of the relation between the two schools is impossible. And so we should, that's why it was a little bit technical, but I think it's important for us to understand the Hinayana's point of view to help us understand Mahayana's point of view. And because of the historical importance and the influence of Sarvastivadins, it's important to understand something about them and how it's different from Mahayana. And that, I think that helps us to understand Mahayana better as well. So to us, Mahayana, we can accept that things conditionally exist, but at the same time, we should be sensitive to the fact that there are other schools that believe something different, that believe that all dharmas exist. But if you look at under the background of conditionality, it doesn't quite make sense that there is something that truly, permanently exists. Okay. This is it's just another way of looking at this, but I don't think we need to go over this. Maybe just an illustration of what we just talked about using painting. This is a very famous way of painting. It's called pointillism, where the painting from afar, it looks like a picture, right? But if you look closely, if I zoom in, you will see that this painting is made of dots of paint. So that's how that is how Hinayanas look at this, is that they see that this painting is unreal, but the dots in the painting are real. So the Dhamma, yes, there is no self, but the things that make up that no self are real. Okay. Hinayana, they are very analytical. They see dharmas as true, whereas Mahayana, very synthetical, very based on conditionality, right? Synthetical here meaning that yes, things exist, but they don't truly exist because they exist conditionally. Mahayana primarily focuses on sunyata. Sunyata, 空性, 空单, is a very important aspect of Buddhism for them. And I thought that it would be appropriate for us to have the proper understanding of sunyata. During the time of the Wu Emperor of China, Bodhidharma, Venerable Master Bodhidharma, he came to China to propagate Buddhism. And he was asked, Emperor Wu asked Bodhidharma questions. What is the highest truth of the holy doctrine? Right? What is the highest truth of Buddhism? Bodhidharma says that the vast emptiness and nothing holy. So there's nothing holy about Buddhism. It's nothing. And Emperor Wu asked him, ask who it, are you a holy man? Who are you? And Bodhidharma says, I don't know. I'm nobody. I'm nothing. It is a big mistake to try to communicate the perfection of wisdom and sunyata in an enigmatic way, meaning very obscure and unclear and mysterious way to those who don't have appreciation, a deep appreciation of Buddhism. Because one of the Bodhisattva's precepts, Pusajie, right, Bodhakye, is to refrain from preaching the doctrine of sunyata to those who are spiritually unprepared. Because what happens is that they can end up interpreting it nihilistically, meaning they think that nothing exists. They believe that nothing exists. They don't understand, they don't see the conditionality. So we should avoid talking about sunyata, kongxing, kongdan, to those who are not well prepared. But if we need to explain sunyata to them, we should also explain to them the relative truth and the absolute truth. And that the relative truth is the basis for the realization of absolute truth. So you cannot just go to absolute truth directly, but we have to go through the relative truth to understand the absolute truth. So even the phenomena are empty, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist. They conditionally exist. So we have to say it, that whole sentence in order to try to make it clear. So, for example, while we should not be attached to our possessions, like our wealth, our family, and so forth, relations, but we should not immediately abandon them first without discovering our own spiritual foundation. So without spiritual attainment to compensate for what you have given up in the world, you will drift aimlessly in misery, in suffering, because you're giving up something, but yet you haven't found something else to compensate for it. You will be lost. You will be lost in the world, and you will be lost in spirituality. This is a true and sad story. There was this person, for some reason, she abandoned her job, her husband, her children, to become a nun in another state. So she left her family. But then after a few years, she encountered a lot of challenges and difficulties. So from that, we could say that she was not spiritually ready. And she unfortunately, did not have any spiritual attainment. So she decided to come back, but unfortunately, her family would not take her back because she just abruptly abandoned them and left without. So to them, it was a big confusion. All of a sudden, the wife, the mother, just left the family to become a nun. So that's what I meant when I said, before you give up what you have, make sure that you have something to compensate for it. Realizing the absolute truth on the basis of relative truth is a safer ground, right? Before we want to leave this world to go to the Western Pure Land, we want to make sure that we have taken care of our responsibilities. Don't leave people hanging, because one is, it's not fair to them. Two, is that we may not be sufficiently prepared, because when we jump from one to another, it's just a form of greed. We want to achieve liberation for ourselves, and we don't care about other people. It doesn't mean that we should be attached to them, but we should be careful in our planning and making sure that we just don't suddenly, abruptly change course without their being pre-warned. We should tell them, yes, this is my intention. You can tell them, let them know, so that they are not surprised, right? So it's being responsible as well. So relative truth here means to observe the precept, 持戒, 止耶, right? We observe the precepts. We practice meditation. We practice merit cultivation, 修福, 修慧, right? 度福, 度对. So that's relative truth. Things that you do, you put in the efforts to do, to accomplish. Absolute truth is wisdom. So relative truth, you can say, is like 戒 and 定, and absolute truth is 慧. So relative truth is meditation, precept, meditation. Absolute truth is wisdom, where you realize that there is nothing to be had, right? You put on all this effort, but at the end, it's really nothing because it's relative. But doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Doesn't mean that it's not worth the effort. When a person abandons everything, that person may not necessarily understand Mahayana. Right? We just don't abandon everything, but we should use our wisdom to navigate towards enlightenment, not just to get rid of everything. Because what happens is that if we don't appreciate the relative truth, if we don't understand the relative truth and we want to jump right to the absolute truth, we could lose our motivation to cultivate merits, to cultivate wisdom, because we see, hey, everything is empty. Why should I put in the effort? And so when we have lost our motivations and our diligence, we will not be able to transform our consciousness, right? 转识成慧, 觉thức thành trí. And so as a result, we will not have real progress, which is needed to transform our consciousness into wisdom and to break through our greed, anger, and other afflictions. So you need this relative truth to put in the efforts to break through the obstructions that we have, which are not real, but they are real because we still have this delusion in us. So we have to deal delusion with delusion. And that helps us to break through our bad habits that are holding us back. That's why when we study Zen, we study Chan, right? Thiền. When we study Zen, we should be very careful, because if we misunderstand the teachings, it can be very disastrous. To think that everything is unreal, everything is false, everything does not exist. So if we want to see our true nature, we have to break through the relative truth to get to the absolute truth. According to Abhidhamma, the 5 skandhas, 五蘊, 五ấm, the 5 skandhas are brought together by force of karma. But the Buddha here is saying that in reality, they were never united, never bound, so they cannot be free. Right? Things that were not born could not be destroyed. So they cannot be united or bound. And the skandhas are unoriginated, 无生, vô生. Therefore, they don't really come into existence. So that's Mahayana's perspective. So when we look at the teachings that there are things that are permanent, that are real, it's very hard to digest, because doesn't seem to jive with the law of conditionality. So the takeaway here is that things conditionally exist, but ultimately they are insubstantial, 无我, vô ngã, and they are always changing. Right? There's no fixed and changing self. And we should do our best, put in our best, provide the skillful conditions, and avoid complacence, and avoid losing our motivation to put in the effort to cultivate merits and wisdom. 修福, 修慧, right? 度福, 度对. So the ground of sunyata is reserved for those who have achieved great merits and wisdom. But until then, we should continue with diligence and strive on. Right? We should overcome, get to the absolute truth by understanding the relative truth. Right? I want to take this and expand this a little bit with science to have realism in what we just talked about. In 1700s, early 1700s, Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he argued that nature, human nature, was alive and had a history and changing over time. This was very for us, we can now understand this very easily, but you have to imagine and appreciate that during this time, science was still very immature, that it was in its early development, and people did not have appreciation of how complex the body was. And they thought that this body, the brain, was fixed entity that could not be changed. So for him to say something like this was very profound, challenging the established institutions. He said that the nervous systems were not machines, but they were alive and they were able to change our nervous systems. The organization of the brain was affected by our experience. And so therefore we have to exercise our senses and mental abilities, just like how we exercise our muscles. What he wanted to transform human education and culture, based on the premise that many aspects of our culture we think are fixed. So this is very common. This is very common misunderstanding even today, that when we talk about conditionality, 缘起, 运可, we think we understand it all, but it's not, because thinking that things are fixed is deep in our nature, and we have to work really hard to overcome that false thinking. Right? We think that our money will last forever, our wealth will last forever. There will also always be tomorrow. Right? So why put in the effort? So that kind of thinking is thinking that tomorrow is fixed. Tomorrow will always be there, and that is not very helpful. But the many aspects of our nature are in fact changeable. And he did experiments to help explain his claim that when he compared human to other species, he saw what he called human perfectibility, and to be defined as human plasticity, malleability, meaning that it could change. So this perfectibility is conditionality, 缘起, in a way, because perfectibility is the ability to change. It is our greatest weapon against the misfortune, right? If you have the ability to change, you can change your misfortune into fortune. You can change what you don't like into what you like. So this perfectibility is the greatest gift to mankind, if you will. So he observed that animals after months of birth, for the most part, what it will be for the rest of its life, So in other words, what he observed in animals was that there was very little change after a few months of birth. But for humans, there was change throughout life due to their perfectibility. We could continue to change even years after birth. So this perfectibility allow us to develop different kinds of mental faculties. And that could change the balance among our existing mental faculties and senses. So this perfectibility is a blessing, but also a curse. It depends on how you use it. Just like a double-edged knife, right? You can use a knife to hurt somebody or to cut a tumor to cure that person. He said the problem with that, with perfectibility, is that it could disrupt the natural balance of our senses. Because the brain is very sensitive to experience, and it is more vulnerable to being shaped by it, like brainwash. I've read a report that in North Korea, a certain population were trained, a population of people were trained with the wrong history, meaning they trained that the leader of the country was a god and that all the other countries in the world were enemies. So they were trained from little on to believe that the whole world was against them. But we were not indulged in that kind of teaching. We think that that kind of teaching is ridiculous. But to them, it was real because their brain was shaped that way. So the brain is very sensitive and it can be shaped. For example, like instantaneous electronic data, like when we use WeChat, when we use, we watch YouTube, those we create this instant gratification, and we continue to want to have that gratification, instant joy. And what happens is that this overly intense and wired people, they created overly intense and wired people with short attention spans. So the more that we are exposed to instant electronic data, it affects our memory, our attention span. So as a result, a new kind of environmental problem interferes with our cognitions, our understanding, our learning. So the concern here was that the balance between our senses and our imagination could be disturbed by the wrong kinds of experience. So change is good, but unless we know where to change, it could be bad. So this perfectibility is a blessing, but it's also a curse. So it's a mixed blessing. So what does it mean for humanity? Because we could change, we did not always know what was natural, what was acquired by our culture. And we could be overly shaped by culture and society to a point where we drifted too far from our nature, our true nature, and became alienated from ourselves. So if human, mental, emotion life, and the brain are malleable, changeable, shapeable, we can no longer be certain what a normal and a perfect mental development would look like, because 无自性, right? Không có tự tánh. So we cannot, this is like relative truth in a sense that we don't know, because the way that we have been influenced by the world, sometimes it's very difficult to see the truth. What does this mean in terms of Buddhism? Nature, according to Buddhism, is not some fixed, unchanging entity, but it has the ability to change. So we can see two levels of change here. One is the lower level change. The other one is lower level change and higher level change. Lower level change is limited fixed for the most part. Like animals we observe, they change very little. They cannot become very intelligent. So that's lower level, animalistic level. And they are shaped by their past karma, their environment, and their current karma. In other words, they have lost their freedom. If you look at the 12 nidanas, 12因缘, thập nhị nhân duyên, it's a cycle of life and death. And forever, we are stuck in that cycle of life and death. Meaning that we oscillate. We cycle from joy to suffering, and to joy back to suffering. So we continue to be stuck in that cycle of life and death. According to Upanishad Sutras in Nikaya Ahan Jing, 相应部, tương ấn bổ, the Buddha talked about 23 affinities. So you can say it's not 12 affinities, 12因缘, but it's actually 23因缘. You can say 23 conditions. Even though it says start with ignorance, but it's not really the beginning. But ignorance leads to karma formation. 行, right? You can follow down here. Of ignorance leads to karma formations, which leads to consciousness, which leads to mentality, materiality, sixfold sense, contact, feeling, craving, clinging, existence, birth, and suffering. And then it continues through suffering that we reinforce our ignorance. In fact, it is here that we reinforce ignorance. This is where we get stuck in the cycle of life and death, is through the sixfold sense base, and then through contact, and we cause rise to unskillful feelings, receptions. But so that is the lower level. But we understand that in this conditionality cycle, it ends. The lower level ends at suffering. But suffering doesn't mean that the more that you suffer, that your life will be better, right? Like 苦行, 口含. It's not that you suffer more that your life will be better. So it's not about enduring suffering, but to understand and to rise above suffering. Right? Does it make sense? Right? This is important. It's not to endure suffering, but to understand suffering and to rise above it. Because when we understand suffering, it leads us to a higher level of evolution. And this is unlimited. It spirals up as opposed to oscillatory, up and down, but the higher level spirals up indefinitely. When we understand suffering, it leads to faith. Faith here means that you put your faith in Buddhism in a sense that you know that it can deliver what you are asking for, what you're seeking. Faith here doesn't mean blind faith, but you know that if you get stuck in this cycle, you will never be able to get out. And so you stop relying on it. You stop relying on your wealth, your possessions, your relations, because you know that those things cannot deliver you to liberation. So you put faith in Buddhism, understanding that it will lead you to liberation. And how does it do that? Well, with faith, it leads to joy. Right? You can follow down here. It leads to rapture, tranquility, happiness, concentration, knowledge, and vision of things that as they are really. Disenchantment, dispassion, liberation, and knowledge of destructions of all kinds of diseases or sufferings. So in other words, when you have faith, you start to realize that the world cannot deliver what you're asking for, and that the spirituality can lead you to liberation, and you have joy because you have found a way to, essentially an answer to your search. So destruction, knowledge of destructions of all suffering. So when we understand faith here is that we understand that we can change and things are always changing, but we need to know where to change. When you know where you can change and the basis for that change, it leads to faith because now you are committed. You are committed to that path because you understand clearly that it can lead you to what you're looking for. It is easy to go through life unconsciously because we have so many burdens, so many distractions in life. And when we don't understand, when we are stuck in the lower cycle, we start to believe that our problems are real, our sufferings are real, and that they are permanent. And as a result, we are drowned in dissatisfaction, in suffering, without knowing a way out. But when we feed our life with the right conditions, with, for example, like practicing the giving of wealth, knowledge, and Dharma. So when we practice the giving, we will notice that your life will not lack of materials. When you have merits, your physical life is abundant with material. And that when you practice giving of knowledge, you will have the result of sufficient intelligence and knowledge to navigate through life. And when you practice the giving of fearlessness, 无畏不施, you will notice that you have enough health to do things that are meaningful for others. So as we practice, we find that there is much more beyond our worldly possessions. And that's what leads you to joy because you no longer have this burden. When we have relations, families, friends, sometimes they can be fun, but yet sometimes they can bring trouble, right? So that's the problem with this world is that it's very relative, up and down, suffering and joy, suffering and joy. And that's a cycle that we cannot exit. But once we understand where the exit is, which is, the key is right here. Through our physical senses, we have contact. We contact with other people, but yet we don't cause rise to unskillful feelings, reactions. Then that is the key is. So it's not to not have feelings, right? It's not to stop seeing, to stop hearing, but to direct our senses towards a positive path, right? To cause rise to skillfulness. So it's not just to cut off from the world, but to lead it in a positive direction. So so based on faith here, we have joy. It is because we have found our answer. So this perfectibility is the ability to change. So that's from a scientific perspective. But from a Buddhist perspective, we understand it as conditionality, and that we should understand that, yes, there is conditionality at a lower level where human beings or all sentient beings get stuck in that cycle. But yet we should understand that there is another level of change, a higher level of change, that you go from faith all the way to liberations to knowledge. So the emphasis here is knowledge, right? It's not just to get rid of our senses, to avoid the world, but how to develop knowledge in the interaction with the world, right? When our eyes see things, we hear sounds, how can we develop knowledge? So that's where, that is the key to liberation, right? So it's not just to run away, but how to deal with things. Okay, so that's emptiness of Dhamma. So we should understand again, based on conditionality, and it's not easy because our tendency is to see things as fixed and unchanging. And it takes a lot to break through that habit, that mentality, because that mentality has been shaped by our environment for a long period of time. So just because we have learned the words doesn't mean that we understand the meanings behind the words. When we can apply the words, the teachings, then we understand, that's when we understand the meanings. Okay, so that will complete the first method of mindfulness, which is mindfulness based on realizing the truth, right? 实相念佛, thực tướng niệm Phật, by understanding the truth. So when we chant Amitabha, it's not just about the mouth moving, but to understand, when we practice method, it helps us, and we should understand reality by understanding deeply the conditionality behind phenomena. Next time when we meet, well, I will discuss about the next three methods of mindfulness. One is mindfulness based on visualizations of the Buddha and his qualities, and then mindfulness of the features of a statue of Buddha, and then mindfulness based on oral recitations of the Buddha's name. And then if we have time, I would like to go over the history of Pure Land Buddhism, because there are people who criticize that Mahayana texts are not true, that Pure Land Buddhism is not true Buddhism. So we look at the history of it, we'll look at how it has developed over time. We will have appreciation for the Pure Land method. Okay, are there any comments? Okay, we do merit dedication. Could you please join your palms? Together we recite. May the merits and virtues accrue today adorn the Buddha Pure Lands, repay 4 types of kindness above, and aid those suffering in the paths below. May those who see and hear of this bring forth the resolve for the Bodhi mind. When this retribution body is complete, together we shall meet in the land of ultimate bliss.